Welcome to my presentation on Quarrelling the Uncanonical Canon of the Orders, which explores how the 5 manners of building, also named the Canon of the Orders, embedded flexible principles and creative invention for architectural design. Just as a brief background, the early modern period started around 1420 and lasted until the late 18th century, and included numerous polemic quarrels on the nature and authority of classical architecture. So by scrutinizing Renaissance printed media, we uncover how early modern designers canonized fluid and flexible rules, seemingly resulting in an uncanonical canon of the orders, and thus challenging the notion of the alleged design rigidity of early modern architecture. Rather than contesting ideas of canon formation, this position paper and work in progress tries to open a transhistorical discussion. Now, when scrutinizing the canon in art, no particular definition of the canon or canon formation exists. However, scholars mostly agree that it is a highly subjective and erratic term. Nevertheless, insofar known, its origin traces to the early 20th century, where it meant rule from its Greek origin, and by the late 20th century was used to denote the great examples within art. And Preziosi mentions that in this regard, one's group masterpieces and another's politically correct or socially relevant artwork perform equivalent disciplinary roles in maintaining hierarchical distinctions. And they remain subjective and ever-changing. Along the same lines, and in defense of the classical, Zonis and Lefebvre defined the architectural canon as constantly modified, like any social convention. The classical building is an expression of this evolving canon that it confirms. At the same time, it is the product and the creator of the canon. And this shows how the canon changed its form and its meaning, denoting an unequivocal rule to being socially subjective, and unveils the problems regarding its meaning. So within this framework, we must look into the versatility of the classical style and the canon of the orders, starting with the debate that took place in the 17th and 18th centuries. So with the end of the Great Turkish War in 1699, the Ottomans were less hostile to the Europeans, allowing them to travel to study Greek architecture approximately for the first time in 300 years. And this led to a quarrel amongst European literati, or the intellectual circles, one group believing in the supremacy of Roman architecture, with people like Robert Adam and Giambattista Piranesi, or the purity of the Grecian or the Greek architecture, as upheld by David Leroy or Johann Winkelmann. And on the screen we see Claude Mathieu de Lagardette's survey of different Doric orders that shows how the architects observed mutable qualities of classical architecture. That also shows the architectural variety of the Doric order rather than providing uninterpretable or universal rules. Such difference can be observed within Greek architecture, and we cannot start to grasp the differentiation and the multiple ornaments that we can actually see in the Roman examples. If we go further, in the preceding century, similar quarrels existed, particularly in France, known as la querelle des anciens et des modernes, which literally means the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns, which was a polemic that contested the authority of either the antique examples or the modern inventions. The dispute was named after Friard de Chambre's parallel of architecture that compared the numerous orders of architecture, but the debate extended far beyond the build profession and included discussions in literature and politics. And many French writers like Racine and Molière supported the authority of the antique examples, whereas the Académie Française and the literary salons upheld the power of the modern art, with people like Colbert and Richelieu and Blondel. So this polemic occurred at the rise of the Enlightenment and relativist aesthetics, and if any canonical pursuit existed, it was only to use rules as mnemonic devices for creative invention, rather than a design limitation of absolute beauty. Hence, depending on reasoning and personal quests, architects had to diverge from various opinions where a universal truth did not exist. Rather, defying rules to create architectural variety seems to have been the only canon, or rule in this occasion, that European societies utilized since the antiquities. But for proving a truly uncanonical canon of the orders, we must turn to its Renaissance origin. So one of the first books that visualized and described the orders was Sebastiano Serlio's Regole Generali from 1537. And we must note that Serlio does not speak of an uninterpretable design rule, but rather speaks of regole, which means rules in plural, and already sanctifies the plurality and the fluidity of design intention in his Renaissance works. His theory superseded the three orders of Vitruvius and followed by the orders of Alberti, Filarete, Francesco di Giorgio, and so on. And these authors always name 3 or 4 types of columns, but refer to them as genera, species, or qualities rather than orders. Cesariano even included 6 orders and included a type of varieties for them. Yet the 5 orders, being the Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite, first appeared in a letter to Pope Leo X, which is at least attributed to Baldassare Castiglione or Raphael, and where the orders are first named ordini, or orders, yet no consistent rules had yet been given to them. In contrast to these earlier architects, Serlio replaced this Attic order for the composite and describes it as mescolata, or mixed. By doing so, he enumerated design principles that formalized what came to be known as the canon of the 5 orders and remains valid today. Yet Serlio differentiated order by defining it in reference to the architectural column, the proportion, composition as part of a unified whole, and orders only apply to the design. He did not mean an irrefutable rule. Rather than a canon, Serlio discussed it as a maniere, which translates as a way or a style of building, and such styles depended on the function of the building and the character of its owner. As such, the orders, as the manner of building, became the departing point for designing sites and buildings. Thus, the Renaissance theoretician had to set parameters for designing the maniere, and in order to do so, Serlio linked the manner of the orders to particular proportions and bodies to make design decisions. Serlio imposed architectural judizio, or judgment, that revolved around the dichotomy of the decorous and the licentious. Here, Serlio allowed for a moral and virtuous design which embodied the good, the judicious, the delicate, the gracious, the decorous. And on the other hand, Serlio attributed immoral and vicious designs to the bad, the capricious, the bestial, the awkward, and the licentious. Such descriptions trace to Aquinas' Summa, or Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and aligning the beautiful to the good and the ugly to the bad form part of the broader setting of Renaissance society. Yet what remains mostly unknown is that these categories of good and bad were not normative but subjective and interchangeable. Rather, based on proper reasoning, Serlio mentions that from license of the ancient examples, some architects stray against the precepts of Vitruvius. And if reason does not persuade us otherwise, we will follow the doctrine of Vitruvius as an infallible guide, but that also means that he allowed license at the discretion of judicious men. While Serlio's overall recommendation is to design judicious buildings, he also outlines that based on reason, license is allowed that the bad and the ugly and the good and the beautiful are interchangeable based on reason and occasion. Now, in order to implement such a system, Serlio aligned his maniere of building to gender to represent the character of the building of its matron or patron. As such, the Tuscan and the Doric align with masculinity. The Ionic counts as both masculine and feminine, and the most ornate and opulent orders of the Corinthian and the Composite are female. The mescolata, or the mixing of the types, is seen in the Ionic, which displays both the effeminacy and elegance of Apollo, but equally Athena's butch-fighting spirit, and even more clearly in the Composite, which is always mixed. This equally includes the mixing of ornaments of animals or the displaying of monstrous beasts known as grotesques. Such an analogy of architecture in the body stems from the Vitruvian tradition as seen in the pagan temples, but was equally alive in Serlio's day. And for example, Albrecht Dürer's Verbuche von menschlicher Proportion, or the 4 books on human proportion, showed the idealized beauty, but also the actual shapes of the human body and the natural order, including children and including underweight and overweight people, as seen on the screen. The order, or the body, was seen as a mutable standard and not as a standard of the divine universal beauty. In reference to the decorous and licentious categories, the body architectural analogy through the body architecture analogy, the orders could change the proportions, and the architect was capable of mixing certain ornaments. And in this context, Serlio even mentioned that there will be a beautiful and well-formed woman who is ornamented with rich vestments, but more serious than lascivious, and all of which add to beauty. Yet the same beautiful woman, when she would have to have extra and unnecessary jewels, will she not be monstrous? So through reason and proper arguing, the beautiful can become ugly and vice versa, and thus constitutes the principle of Renaissance design fluidity within this zoomorph and anthropomorph lens. As a result, these licentious authors required new rules of architectural creation, yet were based on the theory of juditio, and it required rules for reasoned deviation of the rule. So to do so, Serlio classified different principles such as nature and artifice, grace and awkwardness, to digress from the canon. Moreover, Serlio even provided rules to stray from the sacrosanct and immutable proportions of the orders, allowing for a shortening or elongating of the proportions, mixing of its ornaments, and so on, as you can see on both of the examples on the screen. And as such, Serlio provided a standard of the chorus design presented as a canon, and equally provided a theoretical subset to diverge from it. Thus, he reasoned for alterity as part of a fluid decision-making as the norm. And in Serlio's words, these rules allow the architect to have a very refined sense of judgment concerning the variety of the compositions and ornaments of buildings, and concern the amending of the columns' heights. Thus, Serlio refers to amending proportions based on reasoned judgment, and that the decorous in one context may be licentious in another design. Now, in the broader societal context, the monstrous body was one that combined several characteristics of the natural order. Yet the monstrous in its original meaning simply meant part human, part animal, or a hybrid or creature of unnatural size and rarity, such as a whale. For example, people with disabilities also often form part of this context, and the courtesan painting in the case of Antonina Gonzalvus by the paintress Lavinia Fontana, seen on the screen, and that was also later depicted in Ulisse Oldrevandi's Monstrorum Historia, or the history of monsters, were part of that context. And her condition of hypertrichosis exemplified monstrosity as being both human and hairy, or a mix in the same way of the seahorse, which was a mix of the horse and of a fish, and thus must have been monstrous. Yet, unlike today's perception, within these mixed hybrids, they were not necessarily seen as bad or negative per se, nor even as defining moral order. Yet, while often perceived as bad omens, warnings of God, or even demonic possession, they were equally perceived with awe, wonder, and marvel. And think of the unicorn as a fantastical beast. It is a hybrid horned horse, but mostly associated with purity rather than being evil, and exhibits the early modern narrative of the monstrous quite well. Both good and bad, ugly and fantastic, the monster was mostly defined by its rarity rather than anything else. Then to conclude, we see an establishment of rules for the formation of the canon of the orders and classical architecture at large. Likewise, as a hierarchical debate regarding the paragone, or the so-called superiority of the fine arts, was very well established within this period, nevertheless, licentia, or the taking of license to digress from the rules, was very much part of the architectural ingenio, or ingenuity, or the fantasia, or imagination. And the rules of architecture did not prescribe, but instruct personalized critical thinking for either following or admonishing the rule. Thus, we can only read the canon of the orders as an uncanonical one, where the rule only allowed for design invention. And reading into the past means reading into the otherness of the long forlorn, and indicates the difference and change of past societies. As such, we must start perceiving the classical as a highly complex set of rules that allowed for design invention, rather than limiting the designer as a true architecture of alterity. Thank you very much.